Hello, hello, students. Today's Friday. It's the weekend. We can perhaps go out and have a drink with friends, socialize a bit. It's nice that there's some degree of normality, and I certainly am taking advantage of it. Last night, I went to the pub in Assiniboine Park, and with two guys, and we had a great conversation. It's great to do some normal things. So, are there any questions from last time? Okay. Reminder that we have this assignment looking at this first episode of Vietnam television history, and based on that and based on our narrative, if you would write a short 2-page thing on the topic of the French were bringing civilization to Vietnam. This is the way they define their mission. How true is that? That's the essay assignment. And what you do is you look at the documentary, you look at your notes, you put this down in 2 pages, and then you upload to Umlearn. Let's say 3 days after. I think the date was the 2nd, so the assignment is due on the 5th. Any questions?
I assume you want us to source the documentary in the notes. Do you want us to use like Chicago style, or how would you like that
Yes,
done?
you can just parenthesize the source references in the essay. You get me? That you just make a parenthesis and you put in the source.
All right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where is where can we find a link to the video?
Well, if like I just checked, the whole series is easily available on YouTube now. It comes right up. You just say Vietnam, a television history. Well, I'll show you, because I'm going to show some clips from episode 3. You see, do you see this? Oh, I didn't, sorry. Here on the screen, if you see, this is the 3rd episode. But when you Google Vietnam television history, it comes right up. So the 1st episode is what you're looking at.
Okay, so we watch the 1st episode and we make a 2-page.
Yeah.
Okay.
Comment, sort of discussion of the proposition that the French were in Vietnam to bring civilization. Okay.
So it's an argumentative essay then? So
Yeah,
we say
good.
so we say our opinion?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, the people on top actually, that is, say, the politicians and the bureaucrats, the army officers, they believe this. So this is subject to sort of a discussion. And yes, I think when it's better, in my opinion, not to, like, it's in general, having a point of view is better than not having a point of view in this kind of work. Well, it could be a kind of moderate thesis and so on, but essay should have a definite perspective from which you're coming. You can even invent one, I'm talking about this in general. So what I want to do now, this is the agenda for today, is I briefly am going to review how the gem state was set up. Then we're going to look at episode 3. I'm just going to show clips. I'm just going to extract so that to give you a visual sense of what we've been talking about. And then we're going to talk about the development of the insurgency and the growing American involvement from about 1960 onwards. The Americans, of course, were there since 54, but you begin to see that the Americans begin to become militarily involved as early as 1960. So that's the agenda for today. So first of all, just to recall what we discussed last time. Remember, we started with the Catholics, the exodus of the large numbers of Catholics from the north, the establishment of these people in villages around Saigon as a kind of security belt, and also a few of them up in the highlands in various strategic points. The fact that the Catholics, this minority, were an important base of the Diem government. So that's number one. The second thing I said was about the army. The army had grown very large, and in the immediate wake of the Geneva Accords, it was reduced in number, but more importantly, American control of the cash flow made it possible for Diem to control the generals in the army. At first, you'll see changes later, but at first they were able to do this. The Diem was able also, with American help, to control the Buddhist sects who were militarized. The Saigon Mafia was brought under control. Then we talked about the issue of the elections called for by the Geneva Accords and how they were basically canceled. The establishment by Diem of a republic. He gets rid of Bao Dai and establishes a republic. And then we talked about of course, the landlords supported Diem. They certainly were not going to support the Viet Minh or the DRV. They supported the Diem government. But also now the middle class, the Vietnamese middle class, which had been weak under the French because the French dominated the economy and the Chinese, Diem begins to build them up with American support. And I talked about the inflow of American aid and the 20,000 people who were able to get American dollars at a preferential rate. And this became the basis of a Vietnamese bourgeoisie. During the Diem years, there was a real estate boom in Saigon and some of the other cities, and some of these people got rich. And of course, a lot of people in the cities attached themselves to these people who were making money. So a certain party developed, which of course was very pro-Diem. But I noted that they didn't really invest in developing a productive economy, manufacturing. An independent economy did not develop. It was all dependent on American aid. And at the end of the day, and this I contrasted that with Korea, at the end of the day, the absence of such an economy was one of the, in addition to the sort of military weakness, the weakness of the economy ultimately played a big role in undermining the Republic of Vietnam. And of course, I did mention that Bao Dai was replaced, and Diem became the president of what we can call the Republic of Vietnam. That's what its name was. In the north, there was the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh. In the south now, you have the Republic of Vietnam. And there are two armies. In the north, the army is the People's Army of Vietnam, or the PAVN, P-A-V-N. In the south, you have the ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army, funded by the Americans. Then I noted that, yes, there was a legislative assembly, and periodically there were elections, but they were essentially meaningless because Diem reserved all power to himself and his family. I noted that two brothers were basically in charge of the northern city of Hue, the second most important city, and then Diem himself and his other brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, and Madame Nhu, the wife. They were a threesome, a troika, and these three really pulled the strings in the Republic of Vietnam. They had their own political party, the Can Lao, and they had a youth movement called the National Revolutionary Movement. And it was through these means that they basically governed the country. Now, I want to look at, I'm just going through this film, because you can do this. This is an American Jesuit priest who knew Diem when he was back in the United States, and he describes Diem, he knew Diem because Diem was in a monastery in New Jersey when he was in the United States, and he describes him as very aloof, very devout Catholic, and so on, He's giving the background. And then, that's the American general who was in charge. Now, what we have here is the Exodus. The people, Lansdale's evacuation. Here you see the evacuation that's going on. That's Lansdale. Oh, what we see here is the battle, street battle in Saigon, when they mobilized the army against the mafia that controlled Saigon, and Diem was able to consolidate his support. That's Eisenhower, who's behind all this with Dulles. That's Mr. New. That's Dem's brother. That's Dulles. And they're discussing how important Vietnam is. Here's a, oh yes. Well, now they're showing how Diem is trying to organize the government and so on. Well, I won't go further. That you see Diem trying to appeal to the people, and the film says, well, he wasn't really a politician, but he tried to do this. In any case, This gives you some sense of the film. This is one of the best episodes. It describes the Diem years, and it's very good. I recommend the whole series. It's way better than anything else that you would see on film about the Vietnam War. Okay, we'll press on. Well, anyway, what is this? Here's this woman who is a Viet Minh. This young woman, describing. She's a doctor. She was arrested and tortured by Diem. Anyway, the thing is that this was the whole setup, but the regime, in fact, in practice, was extremely repressive. And thousands of people suspected of being Viet Minh or sympathetic to the Viet Minh, or even people who were, I would call them liberals, who wanted a more open regime. For example, they wanted the Legislative Assembly to actually function. People like that were arrested by Diem, and a really tight control was exercised. And you can see this very clearly in the countryside, where traditionally, even under the French, there were, in every village, there was a village council. Every village had its village council. Now, these councils, they go back to the period before the French even conquered Vietnam. But of course, they were dominated by the landlords because they were the most important people in the village. Well, the French allowed these village councils to function under their government, but Diem abolished basically the independence of all of these village councils, and basically using his governors in the provinces, the governors controlled the village council. So what I'm talking about is an attempt to really, at the grassroots, to control things from the central government. Now, the most important issue in the countryside, and this is, of course, where most people lived, was control over the lands. We saw that this was, from the very beginning, this is a huge issue. There are the landlords, there were the French colonialists. They controlled the greater part of the land, and the peasants had to pay taxes. And this was a class issue, and it was certainly, alongside nationalism, the basis of the program of the Viet Minh. And we saw that, in fact, just before the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, in order to mobilize the peasants in the north, Ho Chi Minh announces, if we drive the French out, we're going to institute basically a land reform, land to the peasants. Alongside getting rid of the French, the peasants will have the land, and we will sweep away the landlords. And this obviously has its appeal to the peasantry. Well, what we can say is that in the north, once the DRV is completely in control of the north, following the French defeat, that's exactly what happens, as you'll see in a few minutes. The landlord class is eliminated one way or another, and the peasants are given the land. But the situation in the South was very different. Now, as a result of the conflict with the French, most of the landlords has actually fled from the villages, and they went to Saigon and to the main towns. They were afraid because there was this war in the countryside. So de facto, the peasants, even in the South, controlled most of the land. They were no longer paying rents. So what does Diem do when he basically takes over from 1954 onward? He tries to bring the landlords back, if you can believe it. Whereas in the north, the peasants are given title to the land. Diem, using this bureaucratic and military control, he instructs the administration to go out into the rural areas and to take back the land and to force the peasants to pay rent to their landlords. He tries to reestablish landlord control. Well, this is a critical issue, and of course, it plays a big part in the revitalization of the peasant movement in South Vietnam. It's the biggest issue. I want to, in order to underline how, in my opinion, how short-sighted this is, if we compare the situation in South Vietnam to what happened in Japan right after the war. Now, Japan, for centuries, there had been a feudal landlord class. And this feudal landlord class was the basis of the Japanese military, who, of course, had become fascist during the 20th century. They launched these wars of aggression, the Second World War, and so on. Well, when the Americans took over, one of the first things they did was they announced a land reform. And over the objections of the landlords and the Japanese politicians, the Americans instituted a land reform, and they basically eliminated the landlord class in Japan to make Japan what they considered to be a modern country. Likewise, if you look at South Korea, the same thing basically happened, but in a different way. What happened was the Korean War broke out. North Korea, which was communist, the North Korean army moved southward. And as they moved southward, they gave the land to the South Korean peasants. Same issue. So it was the communists who instituted land reform as they moved south. When the Americans intervened and pushed the communist forces out of South Korea, the question was, well, what do we do with the land? Do we give it back to the landlords? Hell no. No, the agrarian reform instituted by the communists was maintained by the Americans. And so the landlord class is basically removed in South Korea. But here you have Diem insisting, no, we're going to give the land back to the landlords. And that's alongside, of course, a certain nationalism, is the main reason why a peasant insurgency develops in South Vietnam. Well, as this insurgency continues, it's more and more difficult for Diem to control the situation. And so what he does is he begins to set up, he has at this point advisors from British Army advisors. In Malaya, there was a communist insurgency, and what the British did was they basically reorganized the peasants in Malaysia into strategic hamlets. They forced the peasants into these camps, which were surrounded by barbed wire, and they had watch posts, and they separated the peasants from the communist insurgents. Well, Diem basically starts to do this in response to the growing insurgency. More and more the peasants in South Vietnam are forced into these detention camps, which fuels the insurgency because the peasants are furious at the fact that not only is Diem insisting that they pay rent, but he's basically putting them into concentration camps. So it's a snowball. It makes the situation worse. And as a matter of fact, the Americans, they tried to continue this program. In 1962, the Americans rechristened the so-called agrovilles instituted by the Diem into what they called strategic hamlets. It was the same thing in 1962. As the American presence grew, they got Diem to do this, and it all failed. It all fell apart. What Diem should have done is basically given the land to the peasants and get rid of the landlord class. And as a matter of fact, further down in 1971, once Diem was long gone, that's exactly what the Republic of Vietnam tried to do. In 1971, they said they passed the law, okay, there's going to be land reform. But by that time, the land really was fully occupied by the peasants. And the regime in 1971, it couldn't establish any leverage or credit amongst the people for doing this because the land had already fallen into their hands. So this is basically the story. But the main thrust is that the peasant insurgency really gets going because of the land question. Are there any questions about what I've said up to this point? Because I'm now going to describe the development of the insurgency, how it developed. So at the beginning, the Communist Party, which was of course deeply underground, and it took its orders from Hanoi, from Ho Chi Minh and so on, and the communist leadership, they basically said, no, we don't want any problems in South Vietnam. We're trying to establish the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. We want to continue with the land reform and some degree of economic development. We want to strengthen ourselves. They were at first not interested in the insurgency. But the insurgency, as I say, for its own reason, the repression of Diem, the attempt to get back the land, it began to develop its own momentum. And the communists in the North gradually were forced to take a position. Otherwise, they would lose control of the situation. And so at first, the insurgency sort of develops independently. And then around about 1959, the Communist Party actually begins to try to organize and bring it under its control. Let me sort of just a second. Okay. Anyway, let me pick up the narrative. Before I get to the insurgency, I want to tell you what was going on in North Vietnam. While Diem is consolidating power and the insurgency is developing, we should look at what's going on in North Vietnam. And I said at the beginning, the communists in the North were, they said, we want to consolidate. We're afraid that the Americans will move in, and so we don't want problems in the South. Well, the first thing they did was basically institute a sweeping land reform. The peasants, the landlords were eliminated. And when I say they were eliminated, most of them were just chased off the land, but those who resisted were killed or they were imprisoned. And it's estimated, it was claimed that it seems to be true that something like 15,000 landlords were executed in the course of this land reform between 1954 and 1959. Well, in 1958, the communist regime in the North went a step further, and they said, well, the peasants have their land, but we're going to set up co-ops. That is to say, we will pool resources in the villages to market the produce or to provide some machines. There will be co-ops. And so from 58 onwards in the rural areas, they instituted this system of co-ops. And why do I mention this? Because a certain kind of cooperative ethos developed, a kind of mentality. And the result was that productivity actually grew between 1954 and 1965, which was the beginning of the war. And the point is that North Vietnam was self-sufficient in food. And therefore, when the Americans launched their campaign, the North Vietnamese were able to hold out because they had more than sufficient food supplies. The second point is that there was a certain development of industry and infrastructure in North Vietnam. With the help of the Chinese and the Russians, some 1,200 small factories were established in North Vietnam. There were a few big ones as well, but mainly small factories. And in addition to that, a modern health infrastructure, clinics and hospitals and so on were built up and all through the country. And furthermore, an education system, all the kids, a public education system was established, secular education, up to the level of universities, training in science and technology, and so on. And this is important because one has to realize that by 1965, the North had, we wouldn't call it a modern infrastructure, but it had some of the foundations of economic development. And this, along with the food being produced in these co-ops, made it possible for the North Vietnamese to field a modern regular army. The army was known as the People's Army of Vietnam. So what I'm saying, the economic and social developments of the period from 54 to 65 gave the North Vietnam a military capacity. And so what we see from 1964 onwards, the People's Army of Vietnam begins to send regular forces across the 17th parallel to fight alongside the guerrillas against ARVN, the Republic of Vietnam, and the Americans. So the war, almost from the beginning, combines, from the point of view of the communists, guerrilla operations all through South Vietnam, but also regular army units coming down from North Vietnam, become more and more involved in the struggle. And so you see, this is a kind of confirmation of what I said earlier in terms of understanding the military doctrine of the communist side. It's not merely guerrilla, people's war is not merely guerrilla war. That's important. But ultimately, you want to attrit the enemy, you want to wear down the enemy, and you ultimately want to engage him in all-out positional warfare. You need to defeat the enemy in positional warfare. Now, of course, to get ahead of myself, they never did defeat the Americans. They inflicted a lot of casualties, and they wore down the Americans. But the Americans ultimately withdrew, and the final defeat of South Vietnam came because the South Vietnamese army, which the Americans built up tremendously, simply collapsed in the face of the offensives of the People's Army coming down from the north. It's sort of what happened in Afghanistan. The Americans built up the government troops, but as soon as the Americans moved out, the Taliban basically swept the army aside. The army surrendered. Well, the same thing was going to happen in Vietnam. Any questions about what I've said? Okay, so the insurgency gets going in 1956 as Diem institutes this attempt to grab the land, and he is also being repressive. You begin to see here and there people, some of whom have military experience under the Viet Minh, they begin to resist at the local level. But the Communist Party is not directly involved. These local struggles begin to intensify in 1957 and 1958. They get so intense that in the Mekong Delta, remember I told you that the Mekong Delta, a lot of the peasants had been dispossessed. The reason why I was looking for a map of Ben Tri, this is a city in the Mekong Delta. There, the insurgency got so bad that the peasants actually attacked the Arvin, seized their weapons, and actually took over the province. This is a province located on the coast south of Saigon. So I'm saying that the insurgency had become quite serious by 1958. And as a result of that, the next year, so we have this development stage by stage between 56 and 58. And then finally in 1959, the communists realized we have to do something. We have to either we begin to direct this insurgency, or we're going to lose complete control over it. So at this point, they order their activists to basically begin to lead the peasants against whatever landlord influence there is, against the administrators, and against the police and the Diem's army in the field. And so you see an organization beginning to emerge in South Vietnam. Furthermore, it's in around 1959 that the Hanoi in the north begins to send secret communist officials, we call them cadres, back across the 17th parallel. Remember that many Vietnam, 150,000 of Viet Minh had left in 54 with the Geneva Accords, where they begin to trickle back and they begin to take charge of the insurgency, is basically what I'm saying. And this process culminates in 1960. This whole thing is organized in December 1960. The communists create what they call the National Liberation Front, the NLF. The Americans called these people Viet Cong, but the communists create what they call the National Liberation Front, the NLF. And this is the guerrilla organization. It's virtually identical to the Viet Minh. It's a united front because it consists of certainly communists, but also Buddhists and nationalists joined the Viet Cong. The resistance against Diem is not simply the communists. The communists dominate the National Liberation Front, but it does include nationalists and Buddhists. And as a matter of fact, one of the readings that you're doing is a guy who was basically a nationalist, who's a pharmacist, who joins the Viet Cong because he's a patriot, he's a nationalist. He wants to fight Diem and he wants to fight the Americans. So that's his motivation, to give you a sense of that. So the NLF emerges in 1960. It was a broad coalition, which of course ultimately underneath was controlled by the communists. And by 1961, it had become extremely serious. They were in virtual complete control of the Mekong Delta, the South, but also elsewhere in South Vietnam. Most 60% of the land, it's estimated, was under the control of the National Liberation Front by 1961. Now, Diem and the Americans, in response to all this, what I'm saying is that basically a rural insurgency, or we can call it revolution, a snowballing revolution was going on. Diem refused to recognize this, and the Americans also did not. In their propaganda, they basically said North Vietnam is invading South Vietnam. That's the way Diem and the Americans put it. But of course, I explained to you that the 17th parallel was not established as an international frontier between two states. This was supposed to be temporary. So the North Vietnamese, they certainly didn't recognize such a boundary. And so from 1960, the flow of these communist cadres intensifies. And from 1964, regular army units of the PAVN begin to enter the fray in South Vietnam. Well, the problems of Diem, this is the basic problem, but we also see that even in Saigon, Diem is beginning to meet resistance. His regime is so authoritarian and so on that he begins to meet political resistance in Saigon. And so we see in April of 1960, at a hotel in downtown Saigon, there's a political meeting and a press conference. The name of the hotel was the Caravel Hotel. It's like the Hotel Fort Garry in downtown Winnipeg, the Hotel Caravel, Caravelle, Hotel Caravel. It's a French hotel. And there, a group of politicians, anti-communist politicians, hold a political meeting and a press conference in April 1960. And some of these people had actually served in Diem's government. About 10 of them had served in Diem's government. And basically, they denounced the Diem government. They denounced the dictatorship of Diem and his family. and they said the elections were phony, and they said that Diem had arbitrarily arrested thousands and thousands of people. So this was called the Caravel Manifesto of April 1960, and it set the stage. This was in April. Well, in November, the army went into action. The army attempted to overthrow Diem in a military coup in November of 1960. So you see that it's not simply the communists organizing an insurgency in the field, but also there's political opposition from anti-communist elements, liberal elements, also are rebelling against Diem. The only reason that the coup failed was that these army officers who were directing it, they didn't have clear political and strategic objectives. And so they procrastinated. They didn't act decisively. And Diem was able to organize loyal police and army units, and the coup failed as a result. Now, why was the army becoming involved politically? Well, it was because the Americans were shipping in more and more equipment, advisors to trade and lead the Arvin forces against the communists, and the American influence was growing. And these military officers had come under American influence, and the Americans talked about democratizing, liberalizing the regime, because they realized that Diem was an authoritarian and something had to be done. So these army officers, for their own reasons, and partly it was their ambition, were led into opposition. And so the Diem's control begins to crack. And the main thing he becomes concerned with, and this is where we're going to bring this to an end, he begins to realize that the growing American influence represents a danger to him. He's a nationalist. He's an authoritarian. The Americans want to liberalize the government. And he begins to realize that if he allows the Americans in more and more, that they might get rid of him, which is exactly what happened, as we'll see next time.